Hi, this is Ron Cipcic. In this particular video, we're going to take a look at a market type called monopolistic competition. Notice that I've drawn here a continuum between pure competition and pure monopoly. When we talk about pure competition, we're talking about a price taker. We're talking about a firm that actually receives its price or takes its price as a given from the market. And if you recall, when we talked about this in an earlier lesson, the demand curve for this firm is horizontal. And this firm is very small relative to the market, so it's called a price taker. And it has no control over the market price. It has no influence on the market price. If you watched my earlier video on pure competition, you learned that the market affects the firm, but the firm does not affect the market. Now, at the other extreme, we have pure monopoly. And in the case of pure monopoly, there's only one firm, and that firm faces the market demand curve. And that demand curve is relatively steep and downward sloping. And again, this firm is termed a price maker. It has, in a sense, absolute price-making power because it's the only competitor. It's the only firm in the market. So it can basically determine the price. In fact, the market will look to this firm to actually determine the price. Now, the government might step in and regulate it and prevent the firm from charging the profit-maximizing price. But nevertheless, that firm is the dominant factor in determining the market price. Now, there are two market types in between pure competition and pure monopoly. We want to look at one of those today. So the one we're going to look at today is termed monopolistic competition. And the title of the market type suggests that it's something in between the two extremes. Now, as you would suppose, in the case of monopolistic competition, the demand curve is going to be somewhere in between perfectly elastic and relatively inelastic. So let's draw another model here. I'll put a little bit more detail in this. And in this particular case, the demand curve is going to be relatively flat. So let me just go ahead and switch back to my handwriting here, and I'm going to label this with a small d. This is P. This is QD. Notice that this firm's demand curve is not horizontal, but it is relatively flat, meaning there are many substitutes for this particular firm's product. Now, I'll talk about the characteristics of monopolistic competition in a minute, but one of the characteristics is that the firm faces a relatively large number of competitors. There's a difference, though, between monopolistic competition and pure competition. In pure competition, we assume a very large number of very small firms, whereas in monopolistic competition, the number is quite large. The firms don't know all of their competitors, but not as large as the number of firms you'd see in pure competition. Notice that this demand curve is labeled with a lowercase d, which indicates it's not the market demand curve. This is the demand curve for the firm, and this firm handles or meets a segment of the market's needs. So make a note here that this is a segment of the market. So instead of having a case where there's millions and millions and millions of producers, no one firm having any influence over price, or the other extreme where you have only one firm in the market, pure monopoly, this is a case that's in between. The number of firms is relatively large, but what we'll see is the firm can manipulate its price a little bit and may do that to maximize profits. Now, if we go ahead and put in the MR curve, we'll see that the MR curve is also relatively flat. And so if the demand curve is relatively flat, the MR curve will need to be relatively flat as well. So when we draw this model a little bit later, one thing you're going to notice is the demand curve is relatively flat because there's a large number of substitutes for this firm's product. Remember, we're looking at one firm's product. And if there's a large number of substitutes for that firm's product, then that demand curve is going to be relatively flat or elastic. Okay? Now let me just list a couple of the characteristics, and then we'll go ahead and we'll draw this firm and talk about how this firm behaves under conditions of profit maximization. So I'm going to switch to black. Let me get back here to my writing stylus. So characteristics. Let's talk about a few of these before we go any further. So one, we would like to say that there is a relatively large number of relatively small firms. Notice I didn't say very large number and very small. So this is something in between. I like to think of examples like hair salons, for instance. In the particular town that I live in, Grand Rapids, Michigan, there are hundreds of hair salons. Not millions, but hundreds. And a given hair salon does not know all of its competitors. There are so many firms that we don't know who all of the other competitors are, which means we can't strategize against them. However, what we'll see is each firm within the hair salon market within Grand Rapids has some control over the price of what they sell. Now, there are limits to how much a hair salon can move its price because there are literally hundreds of other companies doing roughly the same thing. So there is some limitations to the firm's price latitude, but the firm has some control over its price. So this is something between a perfect price taker and a perfect price maker. So relatively large number of relatively small firms. Restaurants, you could imagine a certain area of town where there's many restaurants. In our town, it might be 28th Street. 28th Street has hundreds and hundreds of restaurants along that corridor. No one restaurant influences the overall market for fast food or takeout food or sit-down food in a restaurant. But the point is, those firms do have some control over the price of what they sell. Their prices have to be close to their competitors, but they have some price latitude. So you have a relatively large number of relatively small firms. Number two, you have relatively easy entry and exiting. So it's not terribly difficult to get into one of these markets. So it's much easier for someone to get into the hair salon business or into the restaurant business than it is for somebody to enter the automobile business, automobile manufacturing business, or something like smartphones. It'd be much more difficult for someone to begin to try to compete against Apple and Samsung and some of these other producers of smartphones than it would be for someone to compete against an area hair salon. Okay, so relatively easy entry, relatively easy exiting, relatively large number of relatively small firms. And then a third characteristic we want to add to this, and it's an important characteristic, one we've not seen before, is we will see in this case something called product differentiation. So these firms will actually attempt to make their products seem different from their competitors. In the case of pure competition, this is impossible. The firms are assumed to produce a commodity. A commodity is something that by definition cannot be differentiated. Corn is basically corn. Within a certain grade of corn, the thousands of producers who might be making that corn are all making basically the same product. On the other hand, if you go to the other extreme and talk about a monopolist doesn't have to worry about product differentiation because by definition the monopoly's product is unique. So monopolies do not have to engage in competitive advertising. There are no competitors, and the product is recognized by consumers as unique. In the market types that are in between the two extremes, however, we will see product differentiation. So the easiest way to lead into this is to think of the 4 P's of marketing. And if you've studied marketing, you've studied the 4 P's of marketing. So let me quickly list these. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these because this is not a marketing class. This is an economics lesson. But one of the 4 P's is pricing. I can differentiate my product from other people on the basis of pricing. So we might do twofers. For instance, there have been pizza businesses that have differentiated themselves against other pizza businesses by offering 2 pizzas for the price of 1, which is just really another way of cutting the price of each pizza. We might give away free dessert. There is no such thing as free dessert. Effectively, when you give away dessert, you're lowering the price of the overall meal. Okay, so pricing strategies are galore. You know, they're all over the place. There's all sorts of things businesses do to try to differentiate their product from other companies' products using pricing strategies. Number 2, promotion. And there's all sorts of things that could be said here about types of promotion. A very common type of promotion is advertising. And again, this is a way to somehow convince someone that your product has advantages that another product doesn't have, real or perceived. So we might advertise for our restaurant, and not only do we give away free dessert, or at least say we do, again, because the cost of the dessert is embedded in the price of the overall meal. There's no such thing as free dessert. But we might advertise on a local radio station and say that if you come to our restaurant, we have these wonderful meals and we also have these wonderful desserts, and we're in a sense giving them away. Well, advertising is a way to let more people know that we're doing the things we do. Number 3, we could engage in differentiation on the basis of placement. Many years ago, certain pizza chains began to deliver their pizzas, and that was a way for them to differentiate themselves. Domino's really made a name for itself probably 30, 40 years ago on the basis of its delivery systems. So placement is definitely one of the 4 P's of marketing. A restaurant may have, a sit-down restaurant, which typically serves customers in restaurant, may also have a takeout window. I'm thinking of Applebee's, where you can pull up and get the meal hot and then take it home. Okay? Papa Murphy's. It's a pizza place where you actually go pick up the pizza, but you bring it home and you actually cook it in your own oven. The idea being that it's going to be fresher if you cook it. So there's lots of ways. Placement is basically the way that the product is distributed, and there's lots of ways that companies can differentiate themselves on the basis of placement. 4, and the last one is the product itself. And we could include in the product even things like packaging. Now, packaging is not a separate P, but packaging would be under product. So the product itself, toothpaste, look at all the different types of toothpaste, the different tastes, the different cleaning properties that are supposedly in these different toothpastes, and cavity fighting powers of these toothpastes. Clearly, companies have tried to differentiate their toothpaste from other toothpaste. Look at the advertising that goes on in the beer industry, but the advertising simply reveals differences in the product. So the idea that a certain beer has fewer calories for those that care about that, or has more hops in it, or has more alcohol content, or something like that. You can change the product to try to get some sort of advantage on the competitor. All right, so these are the 4 P's of marketing. And if I just scroll up, let me just show you something. What's the purpose of product differentiation? Well, the purpose of product differentiation is to move the demand curve to the right, which would also move the MR curve to the right. Remember, they are related. So move the demand curve to the right and to what? To steepen it. So if we were to, say, do some advertising, we might be able to move the demand curve to the right. Let me just go ahead and switch back to the handwriting mode there. So we've moved the demand curve from the green D to the red D. Of course, this would also move the MR curve. It would make the MR curve steeper. So we can move that demand curve to the right and we steepen it. So there's really two things we're doing. We're increasing market share by shifting the demand curve to the right, and we're making the demand curve less elastic, which is another way of saying we're making the buyer less price sensitive, which is another way of saying we're trying to build something called brand loyalty. So the purpose of advertising, I'll just make a note over here. I'll use red to indicate I'm talking about that red movement. Advertising really has two purposes: to increase demand. In marketing, this is called increase market share. And an increase in demand, of course, as you know, is a shift in the demand curve to the right. In marketing, that's called an effort to increase market share. And then number two, we try to increase in elasticity, which means we try to make the buyers what? Less price sensitive, which is another way of saying we're trying to make the customers more what? More brand loyal. So in other words, they're wanting to buy our product regardless of price. Okay, loyal. It doesn't look very much like loyal, so let's try to fix that. There we go. Okay, so the demand curve in the monopolistically competitive case is relatively flat. The firm does have within its power, though, it has within its power tools. Some people would call them weapons, but it has within its power weapons or tools to try to improve its demand position through pricing, promotion, placement, and product. Okay? And I just showed how, basically showed, for instance, how advertising can move the demand curve to the right. Okay? Now, let's go ahead and wrap up the lesson by drawing the firm and talking about how this firm maximizes total profits. And really, we're not going to learn much new here. We're just going to see that the demand curve and MR curve have a different shape, and that alters slightly the outcome. So let's just go ahead and move down, and we'll scroll down and draw this firm. And I'm going to go back to black, so we'll put this in a nicely confined space. And this is the dollar amount, and this is Q. And what you're going to see as you compare these different market types is that basically the differences at the principles level is on the demand side. So we'll put in a relatively flat demand curve. We'll put in a relatively flat MR curve. And so this is our demand curve. This is our MR curve. If the demand curve is flat, the MR curve is relatively flat. And then we're going to draw in our ATC curve. So we'll put in an ATC curve like so. And then MC, of course, as we've talked about, cuts ATC at its minimum point. So something like that. And then where should any firm operate to maximize profits? Well, any firm, be it purely competitive, be it monopoly, be it monopolistic competition, any firm will try to operate where MC equals MR, which we have already determined is the output rate where the firm maximizes total profit. And then we're going to read up, and we're going to pick up the price off the demand curve. So we'll read across here. Here's P max. And P max is not the maximum price. There are prices above P max, but this firm is going to maximize its profits if it operates where MC equals MR. And then we'll pick up the ATC point at that. and there's ATC, and here's our profit box. So there we go. And we can put, we could put some numbers on here if we want. We could say this is $18. Maybe this is haircuts. Maybe the average cost of a haircut is $13. And maybe this, perhaps this salon or this salon operator sells 5,000 units a year. So what's the profit? Price minus ATC times what? Times Q. What do we have here? 18 minus what? 18 minus 13. Average profit of 5 times what? Times 5,000. So average profit of 5 times 5,000 units would be $25,000 profit. Okay? So again, you say, well, this looks a lot like the monopoly model. It, in a sense, looks something like the purely competitive model. It does. Where we're going to see the difference between the market types is on the demand side. Okay? And of course, this firm would like to do things to build brand loyalty and make the buyers more price insensitive. And this firm would love to do things to try to move its demand curve to the right. As I mentioned, this firm might engage in advertising or other sorts of things to try to push this demand curve to the right and to steepen it. So advertising would be something the hair salon could do to try to boost its customer base. It might try to design its services in such a way that they seem unique to the user, relatively unique compared to other hair salons. There's all sorts of things that hair salons could do to try to build their business. All right? Well, that concludes our lesson on monopolistic competition.